The first snow of February fell quietly over Willow Creek, that small Montana town where the mountains meet the sky. It wasn't a storm, not yet just the kind of snowfall that hushes everything. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Officer Lucas Merritt sat in his truck on the forest road, headlights dimmed, watching flakes drift through the beams like soft pieces of ash. He'd done this route 100 times, but that morning felt different. He couldn't have said why, only that the world looked almost too still, like the calm that settles before something is revealed. He thought he was alone in the snow, until he saw movement, faint, deliberate, and wrong somehow. Through the thin veil of white, a shadow moved across the ridge. Not a person, not a deer. Something lower to the ground, fighting the wind. Lucas leaned forward, eyes narrowing. His first thought was bobcat. They roamed these woods wild and fierce, rarely seen in daylight. But this one, it wasn't running. It was staggering, and in her jaws, something small hung limp against her chest. He cut the engine, letting the silence return. Then he stepped out, boots sinking into snow that creaked like old timber. The cold bit through his gloves, but he didn't move. Quickly, he didn't want to frighten her. From across the frozen creek, the bobcat turned her head. Her coat was a patchwork of frost and tawny gold. Her ears twitched, once wary but unbroken. And there it was again, that small shape she carried. A cub. Its tiny paw dangled against her chest, blood darkening the snow where she stepped. Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. The kind of ache you don't expect out there, surrounded by pines and silence. He whispered under his breath, more to the cold air than to the animal. "You shouldn't be out here, girl." She paused at the sound, the way wild things sometimes do when they recognize care instead of threat. Then she moved again, slow and steady, heading up the hill, where the ridge curved back toward the forest. Her paws left small, deliberate marks, each one darker than the last. Lucas followed, keeping his distance. The snow muffled every step. The only sound was his own breathing and the soft ticking of his wristwatch, faint but steady, like a reminder that time was still moving, even when everything else seemed frozen. In that moment, Lucas wasn't the officer anymore, not the man in uniform, not the voice of law or wildlife protection. He was just a witness. A man watching a mother fight the impossible cold for something she refused to let go. The road twisted through birch trees, their silver bark catching light like glass. He could barely see her now, a blur of motion against the white slope ahead. The cub's tail brushed the snow once, twice, then both vanished behind a rise. Lucas exhaled, breath fogging in the air. He radioed softly. "Dispatch. This is Merritt. I've got a bobcat sighting, adult female injured cub. No aggression noted. I'll stay with her until she finds cover." He clicked the radio off before the static could answer. Something told him this wasn't about paperwork or wildlife reports. This was about presence. About being there when life, even wildlife, asked for grace. An hour passed before he saw her again. The trail led to a slope overlooking the valley where an old ranger cabin sat half buried in snow. It hadn't been used in years, not since the Forest Service moved its operations closer to town. The roof sagged under the weight of winter, and the windows were frost-clouded and still. The bobcat paused at the cabin door, sniffed the air, then slipped inside through a half-broken panel. Lucas waited, giving her space. His breath came out shallow, controlled. He'd seen death before on roads and floods in small ways that leave a scar. But what he saw that morning wasn't death. It was defiance wrapped in fur and silence. Something sacred, even if he didn't have the words for it. He took a slow step forward. The snow beneath his boot collapsed with a soft sigh. Another step, then another. His hand brushed the wooden post of the porch, the grain rough beneath his glove. Through the doorway, the cabin was dim, but he could just make out the faint movement of her tail, the small lift of her shoulders as she lay the cub down near a pile of old quilts. And then, for the first time since dawn, the forest exhaled. The wind returned, whispering through the trees like a long-held prayer released. Maybe it's human nature to see ourselves in the animals we meet, to read their silence like scripture. But standing there, Lucas didn't feel powerful or superior. He felt small. Small in the way you feel when the world reminds you that survival isn't cruel. It's courageous. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called a single note echoing across the valley. Lucas looked up the gray sky stretching endlessly above him. He thought of the times he'd been helpless too, when he couldn't save what he loved most. And for the first time in years, he whispered a quiet thank you into the air. Not because the bobcat understood, but because he finally did. When you work close to nature long enough, you stop believing in coincidence. You start believing in timing. Maybe that's what this was, timing. That he was there when a creature too proud to beg for help finally needed it. He could have turned back, called it a day, filed the sighting like a dozen others. But something in that mother's eyes stayed with him, not fear, not even pain. Just love that refused to surrender, even when the snow made every step a question. And that love, fierce, unspoken, bound by instinct, felt familiar. Because love in its truest form isn't loud or dramatic. It's the quiet choice to keep going, even when no one's watching. As twilight deepened, Lucas marked the cabin's coordinates in his notepad. He would return in the morning with food, maybe bandages, and the kind of help that didn't come with cages or rules. The snow thickened again, the world dimming into shades of silver and blue. Behind him, his patrol truck stood, half-buried engine, cold windows glinting faint light from the moon. And in the cabin behind him, a mother and her cub, huddled in silence, kept alive, not by warmth, but by will. That night, Willow Creek slept unaware that something extraordinary had just unfolded in its woods. Not a rescue, not yet, but the beginning of one. Because what Lucas found in the snow wasn't just an injured animal. It was a story waiting to be told, a reminder that even in the wildest places, love endures. If you've ever witnessed a moment that reminded you of kindness, quiet, unspoken, almost hidden, hold on to it. Those moments are proof that compassion still exists in this world. And sometimes it walks on four paws through the snow. By the time the morning sun crept through the trees, the storm had softened into mist. The forest no longer looked harsh, it looked like it was holding its breath. And inside that quiet, Officer Lucas Merritt found something he never expected, a story frozen in time, waiting for someone to listen. The cabin stood just beyond a bend in the trail where the pines bent low as if to guard its secret. Snow clung to the roof like thick frosting, and frost painted the windows opaque. He could still see the faint line of the bobcat's paw prints from the night before, circling once, then disappearing beneath the porch. Lucas approached slowly, his breath visible in the cold. He knelt, brushed snow from the porch boards, and noticed the smallest thing, the edge of a brass key half buried in the drift, dulled by weather, but unmistakably human. It wasn't just a den anymore. Someone had lived here, loved here. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was still heavy with the scent of pine and something faintly sweet like dried lavender. Light slipped in through the cracks of the boarded window, falling over dust-old books and a quilt folded neatly across a wooden chair. It wasn't abandoned in the way most forgotten places are. It was kept gently, reverently. On the table near the fireplace sat a photograph. A woman, smiling faintly, her hand resting on the shoulder of a man in a firefighter's uniform. Behind them, the very cabin where Lucas stood. He turned the frame over. On the back, written in faded ink, Grace and Daniel Holloway, Willow Creek, 2013. Every creature finds its way home. The name stirred something distant in his memory, a report he'd read early in his career. A fire, a lost life, a woman who stayed behind when everyone else moved away. Grace Holloway had been a ranger here once. The woods had taken her husband, and she had refused to leave them. Lucas set the frame back, careful not to disturb the layer of dust that time had left. Then he heard it, a soft sound just beyond the back wall. Not the growl of a wildcat, not the rush of wind. It was the faintest rasp of breathing, labored but steady. He turned, moving toward it quietly. Behind the stove, through a gap in the boards, he could see the bobcat, the same mother from the night before, curled around her cub, both tucked beneath a blanket of old rags. The cub's leg was wrapped clumsily in what looked like a piece of human fabric torn from a sleeve or a scarf. Lucas froze. The cloth wasn't new. It had been there for some time. Whoever had once lived here had cared for her too. Grace. The realization came not as shock, but as awe. The woman who had stayed behind, she hadn't just mourned her husband here. She had lived here quietly, helping what the world overlooked. The bobcat hadn't chosen this cabin by chance. She had returned to the last place where she was once shown mercy. Lucas knelt near the stove and whispered, "You remember her, don't you?" The cat didn't move, but her ears twitched slightly. The cub breathed easier now, chest rising and falling with a faint rhythm. He looked around, the small space, the shelves lined with labeled jars, wild herbs hung to dry from the ceiling beams, and a small wooden cross nailed above the window. Beneath it lay a notebook, its cover worn smooth. He opened it carefully. Inside were dates, sketches of birds, notes about fox dens, and small reflections written in graceful cursive. The wild does not forget kindness. Every creature finds warmth in faith in fur or in hope. Daniel's watch still ticks every morning. Maybe it's his way of telling me he's near. Lucas read those lines aloud quietly, his voice catching near the end. Then he looked toward the small table by the window, and there it was. A brass pocket watch, its surface dulled with years resting atop a folded flannel scarf. He picked it up, feeling its faint vibration. It was still ticking. In that rhythmic pulse, tick-tick-tick, he could almost hear the heartbeat of this place. Grace had waited here long after everyone stopped looking for her, believing that one day the forest would bring her a reason to stay. And maybe it had. There's something deeply human about waiting, about believing that love once given never truly disappears. Standing in that cabin, Lucas felt as though he'd stepped into the space between loss and faith, where the two meet and somehow make peace. He thought about his own house back in town, quiet, empty, except for the ticking of his own clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. No laughter, no warmth. Maybe that's why he followed the bobcat through the storm. Maybe that's why she didn't run. Because somehow they were both searching for the same thing, a place that still remembered them. Outside, the wind began to shift, brushing through the tall pines like a whisper. Lucas looked through the cracked window at the gray sky beyond. And for a brief moment, he imagined Grace standing there years ago, her hair dusted with snow, her eyes soft with patience. She must have known the forest would one day need her again. We talk a lot about courage, loud, heroic courage that saves lives and makes headlines. But there's another kind, the quiet courage of those who choose to stay. Grace Holloway never left. She didn't seek recognition or rescue. She just waited, kept her fire burning, and opened her door to whatever life or God sent her way. And now, years later, that act of love still echoed through a wild mother, through an injured cub, through a man who'd nearly forgotten what faith looked like. It wasn't the kind of faith that demands answers. It was the kind that trusts timing, that believes help comes exactly when it's meant to. Lucas spent the next hour clearing the snow from the porch, stacking wood near the stove, and setting out a bowl of water he'd warmed with his hands. When he looked up, the bobcat's golden eyes met his through the slats in the wall. No fear, just stillness. The cub stirred slightly, a faint purr rising from its throat, a sound small enough to melt the edge off winter itself. He placed the pocket watch gently back on the table beside Grace's open notebook and whispered, "You were right, Grace. They find their way home." Then he closed the door softly behind him. The snow was lighter now, melting into the creases of the earth. Down the trail, his footprints overlapped with the cat's, a strange, tender symmetry. Tomorrow, he'd return. There was more to learn here. About Grace, about the bobcat, and about the quiet faith that seemed to live in this place. And though he didn't yet know it, this was only the beginning, the first small thaw in a heart that had been cold for far too long. If you've ever kept faith in something, a person, a dream, a promise, even when the world told you to give up, you understand Grace. Her story reminds us that love once sown doesn't die. It waits. It lingers. And sometimes it comes back through the snow in the most unexpected form. When Lucas opened the cabin door again at sunrise, the forest was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but sacred. He didn't come with authority this time. He came with a blanket, a small tin of water, and a quiet promise, "I'll help you if you'll let me." The bobcat watched him from the shadows, her golden eyes steady and unblinking. The cub stirred against her, weak but breathing. Lucas set his things down by the stove, careful not to startle her. He knew better than to reach too quickly. Trust isn't something you grab. It's something you earn. He knelt a few feet away, the warmth from the fire flickering across his gloves. Slowly, he took out the small first aid kit he'd carried since his days as a ranger. The tin latches clicked softly, a sound barely louder than the ticking of the old pocket watch on the table. And for a moment, everything in that small cabin seemed to fall into rhythm. The fire's crackle, the ticking clock, his own heartbeat steadying. When the mother bobcat didn't move, Lucas reached for a clean strip of gauze. The cub's leg was swollen, wrapped in that same torn fabric he'd seen yesterday. The wound looked like a snare injury, the cruel metal bite of a trap that had since been broken. He whispered, "It's all right," and inched closer, inch by inch. The mother's tail twitched once, but she didn't strike. Lucas had spent years patching up animals' hawks with broken wings, foxes hit by trucks. But this felt different, more fragile. The kind of care that didn't just demand skill, it demanded presence. He placed one gloved hand on the floor, palm up. The cub's tiny paw rested there, trembling. Beneath the fur, he could feel its pulse, faint, rapid, determined. He worked slowly, cutting away the old fabric, cleaning the wound with water warmed by the fire. Every motion was measured, every breath deliberate. He didn't realize until halfway through that his own hands were shaking not from cold, but from memory. Years ago, he had knelt just like this beside a different small body. His son Evan, 8 years old, brave and curious, too young to understand how quickly a river can turn. It had been spring runoff that year, the snow melt swelling the creeks behind their house. Lucas remembered shouting, reaching the weight of the current dragging them both under. He remembered the silence that came after the unbearable quiet when he realized Evan wasn't breathing. The paramedics had said he'd done everything right, that some things just happen too fast, but no one tells you what to do with the guilt that follows. It had stayed with him heavy and visible through every patrol, every long night in the woods, every call where someone needed saving. He saved what he could, because he couldn't save him. And now, in this old cabin with a wounded cub under his hands and a wild mother watching him, it felt like life was giving him a chance he never thought he'd get again. There's a quiet kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect words. It comes from the small, steady moments when something broken lets itself be touched. As he wrapped the cub's leg, Lucas thought about how fragile things survive, how a bobcat carries her child through a blizzard, how a man learns to love the world again by helping what he doesn't understand. When he finished, the mother bobcat leaned forward slightly, her nose brushing the cub's fur, then just barely the edge of Lucas's sleeve. It wasn't a gesture of thanks. Not exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a simple truth between two creatures who had both lost too much but refused to stop showing up anyway. The more time Lucas spent in that cabin, the more he realized how little separated human grief from the wild's resilience. We like to think we're different, more rational, more composed. But strip away the words, the walls, the noise, and what remains is the same heartbeat. Protect what you love, even if it costs you. Maybe that's what drew him there, not duty, but recognition. The bobcat's eyes were a mirror reflecting a pain he'd carried too long in silence. And somehow, tending to her cub felt like tending to the part of himself that had stopped believing in second chances. The cabin became a place where time softened its edges. Every morning, Lucas brought water and kindling. Every night, he left without a sound. And with each day, the cub grew stronger, its small paws pressing into the quilt, testing the weight of life again. One afternoon, he heard it purr, a sound so gentle it felt like forgiveness. The day the cub first stood wobbling on its bandaged leg, the sunlight broke through the window for the first time in weeks. It caught on the brass pocket watch on the table, a tiny flicker of gold that filled the room with warmth. Lucas smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the face but lives deep in the chest. He thought of Grace Holloway's words in her notebook. The wild does not forget kindness. He realized then that maybe Grace hadn't just written that for herself. Maybe she'd written it for whoever would find this place next for him. Because kindness, like pain, travels. It passes through time, through hands, through hearts, until it finds someone willing to keep it alive. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, delicate flakes catching in the branches. Lucas gathered his things, careful not to disturb the quiet. As he stood, the bobcat lifted her head. Their eyes met one last time before he turned toward the door. He stepped into the cold, pulling the collar of his jacket against the wind. Behind him, through the cabin's thin walls, he could still hear the faint rumble of the fire, the sound of life continuing stubborn and small. He didn't know what waited for him beyond those woods, but something inside him had shifted. The ache was still there, yes, but it no longer hollowed him out. It filled him with something steadier. Not closure, not even peace. Just the quiet knowing that compassion had found its way back to him one heartbeat at a time. Tomorrow, he would have to face the town. They'd heard about the bobcat by now, and not everyone believed in mercy for wild things. But tonight, under the falling snow, Lucas let himself breathe. He glanced once toward the cabin and whispered, "Hang on, little one. The world's still kind. If you've ever carried a loss that still aches quietly in you, let this remind you. Healing doesn't always come in big moments. Sometimes it arrives gently through helping hands, through a small act of mercy, through a creature brave enough to trust again. Those moments matter. They're proof that even in the coldest seasons, love still finds a way to return." By the time the fourth morning came, the story had already slipped past the tree line and into the town, carried not by wind, but by whispers. Whispers that traveled from the post office to the diner to the church steps where people liked to linger and talk about everything that wasn't theirs to hold. And somewhere in those quiet rumors, truth began to bend. Lucas had known it was coming. In Willow Creek, news spread faster than thawing snow. You couldn't hide much, not even kindness. The first whisper came from the clerk at the gas station, who'd seen his truck parked near the old ranger cabin for hours at a time. The second came from a hunter who swore he heard a wild cat crying from that direction. By the third day, the story had already changed. Officer Merritt's feeding a predator. By the fifth, it was worse. He's keeping it alive. Lucas didn't blame them. Fear was the town's oldest language. He drove down Main Street that afternoon, his patrol truck rolling past the bakery, the hardware store, the snow-covered benches that framed the square. Faces turned as he passed. Some waved, most didn't. At the far end of the street, a sign leaned in the wind. Town meeting Thursday, 7 p.m. Topic, wildlife safety. He didn't need to guess what that meant. The next morning, the call came from Mayor Richard Keene. Lucas, the voice said, clipped but polite. "We've got concerns about what's happening out there near the forest road. The people are worried." "You understand? Worried." That word again. It was never about what people saw, it was about what they feared. Lucas met the mayor at the town hall that afternoon. The old brick building still smelled of lemon polish and paper, like time had settled in the corners and refused to leave. Richard stood by the window looking out at the square below. "People think you've lost your edge," he said, turning, "that you're letting your heart get in the way of your badge." Lucas didn't answer. He'd heard versions of that before. The mayor sighed. "Wild animals aren't sentimental, Lucas. You help one and next time it's your dog, or someone's child. It's not worth the risk." Lucas looked at him, voice quiet but firm. "It's not about risk. It's about responsibility. The traps out there shouldn't be in our forest. Someone's setting them, and that's what started all this." A pause. Then the mayor's jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction that told Lucas he'd touched something true. "I'll look into it," Keene said quickly. "But in the meantime, leave the animal be. We can't have more attention. Attention. Another word for truth." That night, Lucas stopped by the diner for coffee. It was quieter than usual, just a few regulars and the hum of the old jukebox in the corner. Marjorie, the woman who ran the place, filled his cup without asking. "Cold night," she said softly. "Always is," he replied. She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lucas, they're saying you've been keeping something alive out there. Something wild." He nodded slowly, a bobcat and her cub. "She's hurt, but she's not dangerous." Marjorie studied him for a long moment, then set a small bag on the counter. Inside were 2 loaves of bread still warm. "I don't care what they say," she whispered. "Just do what feels right." Lucas smiled the kind of smile that carries both gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she replied. "Thank Grace." She did the same once nursed a fox through winter years ago. Folks called her foolish, too. The words hung between them soft but heavy. Kindness in small towns can be a lonely act. It doesn't always get applause. Sometimes it just gets misunderstood. Lucas thought about Grace Holloway. Then how she must have endured the same kind of talk, the same half-smiles that turned to judgment once backs were turned. Yet she'd stayed. She hadn't fought the whispers. She'd simply outlasted them. Maybe that's what courage looked like, not loud defiance, but quiet endurance. The kind that keeps doing good even when no one claps for it. The next morning, Lucas returned to the cabin with Marjorie's bread and a fresh bandage. The bobcat was waiting still, cautious, still watchful, her cub stronger now, its injured paw pressing lightly against the floorboards. He broke off a piece of the loaf, set it near the stove, and smiled faintly. "Someone still believes in you, Grace," he murmured. The pocket watch on the table ticked in reply, steady, patient, eternal. Sometimes it isn't evil that destroys a place. It's indifference. It's the quiet, reasonable voice that says, "It's not my problem," or "It's too small to matter." That voice had crept into Willow Creek over the years, not from malice, but from fatigue. Life had worn people down until compassion felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. But compassion was never a luxury. It was the only thing that had ever saved them. Lucas saw it in Marjorie's bread, in the way the young clerk looked away when gossip started, in the silence that followed the mayor's warning silence that might one day turn into conscience. And he thought maybe change doesn't come in storms. Maybe it comes in whispers too, but kinder ones. A few nights later, Lucas couldn't sleep. The town meeting was tomorrow. He could already imagine the looks, the questions, the quiet accusations. He stood at his window watching the snow fall softly against the street lamps. Then he saw movement near the edge of the woods, quick, deliberate, familiar. Sable, the bobcat, is moving through the snow with purpose. The cub followed, small but steady. Something about her pace unsettled him. Not fear, not hunger, determination. Lucas pulled on his coat, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped into the cold. He didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just moving, she was leading. And where she was heading would change everything he thought he knew about this town, about Grace, and about the line between mercy and justice. In every small town, there are stories like this. Moments where kindness is tested against fear. If you've ever chosen compassion when it wasn't popular, you know how much courage it takes. Keep choosing it anyway, because even when the world whispers against you, mercy still echoes louder if you let it. It began with a sound so small you could have missed it, a low growl, deep and uncertain, threading through the trees like a warning carried on breath. By the time Lucas stepped outside, the forest wasn't still anymore. It was awake. Snow drifted softly across the clearing, each flake spinning slowly under the light of a pale moon. The cabin behind him glowed faintly, the warm pulse of a small fire visible through the cracks in the wood. Lucas tightened his coat, flashlight in hand, and followed the trail of paw prints leading away from the porch. They were fresh, sharp-edged, deliberate. The bobcat's stride was shorter than usual, as if burdened by something unseen. He whispered into the coal. "Where are you going, girl?" The forest didn't answer, not with words anyway. But the air carried a weight to it, an old kind of silence that pressed down on the snow like memory. He walked until the cabin light vanished behind him, replaced by the shimmer of frost and the rhythmic crunch of his boots. Then in the distance he saw her Sable standing in a small clearing, her fur dusted with moonlight, the cub crouched beside her. She was staring at something he couldn't see. When Lucas reached the clearing, he saw it the skeleton of an old fire tower, blackened and collapsed, the metal twisted into crooked angles. The remains of a fire that had once torn through this forest years ago. Grace Holloway's husband had died here. He remembered reading the report long ago before the details faded into rumor. The official story was accidental ignition, but something about that never sat right. Grace had tried to reopen the investigation and the town had turned its back. Now here he was, standing among the ashes of her unanswered prayers. Sable moved closer to the ruins, sniffing at the base of a charred post. Then she pawed at something half buried in the snow, a glint of metal. Lucas knelt, brushing away the frost. Beneath it lay a small rusted tag. He turned it over in his hand. The engraving was faint, but the words were still clear. Property of Keen Logging Co. He stared at it, the cold biting his fingers, the wind suddenly sharper. It wasn't just a forest fire. It had been negligence. The same company now owned most of the land around Willow Creek, including the trapping territory where Sable had been hurt. And the man who ran it now sat in the mayor's chair. Lucas's breath came slowly. He could almost hear Grace's voice in her journal. The forest keeps secrets, but only until it's ready to be heard. He stood there, the snow falling harder, until the world blurred to shades of white and gray. Sable had settled near the wreckage, her cub pressed close. He knew then that this wasn't a coincidence. She hadn't come here to remember. She had come to show him. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows over the wreckage. Beneath the tower's collapsed platform, something metallic glimmered faintly. Lucas brushed aside the snow and found a second clue. A broken trap, rusted old, but still cruel. The hinge bore the same mark as the tag. Keen Logging Co. He exhaled, long and low. The pieces began to fit the traps, the fire, the silence. The mayor's warnings weren't about safety. They were about keeping the past buried. Lucas looked up at the sky, the stars hidden behind a curtain of snow. "Grace," he whispered. "I think I'm hearing you now. There are nights when the world feels closer, when every sound, every shadow seems to breathe with you." This was one of those nights. Standing in that clearing, Lucas felt something shift deep inside him, a quiet alignment between what was broken and what could still be made right. He thought of the town of their fear, of the way they'd built walls out of gossip and excuses. He thought of Grace, how she'd carried truth alone until it became too heavy. And he thought of Sable, a creature that didn't speak, didn't explain, yet somehow told the whole story through her persistence. The wild had never forgotten what people chose to ignore. It simply waited. Sometimes the forest speaks not in voices, but in patterns, in echoes, in the way it leads you back to what you've been avoiding. Lucas realized that justice wasn't just about proving who was guilty. It was about restoring what had been taken. Trust, dignity, balance. Grace's death, the fire, the traps, they weren't isolated tragedies. They were part of a pattern, the slow erosion of kindness beneath profit and pride. And yet, even here, life had persisted. Trees had regrown through the ash, snow had softened the hard edges of ruin, and a mother bobcat had found her way home. Lucas looked at the pair huddled near the fire tower and felt an ache he couldn't quite name, something between sorrow and awe. He thought, maybe Grace isn't about forgetting the hurt. Maybe it's about standing in the same place where it happened and choosing to see life again. By dawn, the storm had calmed. The forest looked reborn silver, still forgiving. Lucas gathered the tag and the broken trap, tucking them into his jacket. The proof he carried wasn't just metal, it was a voice for the voiceless, a truth finally uncovered. As he turned to leave, Sable watched him go, her cub nestled safe beside her. For a brief second, their eyes met again. It felt like a blessing, one living soul passing its trust to another. He made his way back toward town, the horizon pale with morning light. He knew what he had to do now. The truth wasn't just his to keep, it was the town's to face. And the next time Willow Creek gathered in that hall, it wouldn't be to talk about fear. It would be to remember what courage looked like and who had shown it first. Sometimes life doesn't whisper, it roars, but only to those willing to walk far enough into the quiet to hear it. If you've ever been guided by something, a moment, a memory, a sign that reminded you to stand for what's right, don't ignore it. That's how the world speaks. That's how it heals. The snow stopped the night before the meeting. By morning, the air felt different, clean, like the world had exhaled. The sky above Willow Creek was the kind of soft blue that makes you believe spring might actually find its way through. But inside the town hall, the air was tight, and no one dared breathe first. Lucas stood near the back, his cap in his hands, the folder tucked under his arm. He hadn't planned to speak that night. He'd planned to let the facts do it for him, the trap tag, the rusted logo. the map of the fire zone he'd found half buried under ice. But looking at the faces turned toward the dais. The mayor, the council, the people he'd grown up beside, he realized facts alone weren't going to change them. Not here. Not in a town that had learned to hide its heart behind routine and weather talk. Sometimes people don't need more proof. They need permission to feel again. Mayor Richard Keene opened the meeting with a smooth voice, the kind of tone used to quiet trouble before it begins. Thank you for coming. We're here to discuss ongoing concerns regarding wildlife safety in the Northern District. Officer Merritt. He paused, eyes briefly catching Lucas's, has been directly involved. The murmuring began almost instantly. Lucas stepped forward, unfolding the folder. He didn't bother with formality. He simply said, "Before we talk about safety, I want to talk about truth." He placed the rusted trap and the metal tag on the table. The sound echoed faintly against the oak surface, small but sharp. These, he said, were found at the old fire tower site. Same site where Grace Holloway's husband died, trying to stop the flames. The room went still. He held up the tag. This belonged to the company that once managed those lands and still does. They were responsible for the fire. The same company that's been setting traps out there even though they're banned by state law. Someone in the back whispered, "That can't be." Lucas met the mayor's eyes. "It can. And it is." He opened the notebook Grace had left behind the pages, trembling slightly in his hands. She wrote this before she died. About the fire, about the land, about how she believed this forest could forgive us if we learned to stop taking from it. He paused, glancing toward the window where the light snow outside caught the reflection of the room. "I think she was right." Lucas's voice softened. "A few nights ago, I followed a mother bobcat through the storm. She carried her cub in her mouth, hurt, bleeding, half frozen. She led me straight to that tower. To this." He gestured toward the table. "I think she wanted someone to finally see what Grace couldn't make them see back then." For a moment, no one moved. The sound of the radiator humming filled the silence. Then, from the front row, a woman spoke, Marjorie the baker, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I remember Grace," she said softly. "She brought me food after my husband got laid off. Folks said she was strange, but she just cared deeper than most." Her words broke something loose. An older man nodded. "She helped me when the flood hit in 15. Never asked for anything back." Someone else murmured, "She patched up my dog when the vet was closed." One by one, memories began to fill the room, not loud but certain, like embers reigniting under ash. Lucas stood quietly, letting them speak. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It was finally being remembered. There's a moment, rare and fragile, when a community stops protecting its comfort and starts protecting its conscience. You can feel it in the air, like the whole room exhales at once. That's what happened that night. The shame, the years of pretending not to know all of it, seemed to lift a little, and in its place came something quieter, stronger, humility. When the meeting adjourned, no one left right away. People lingered, shaking hands they hadn't in years, talking softly about what could be done next. The mayor didn't say much, but when Lucas passed him at the door, he nodded not in approval, but in surrender. The kind that comes when truth can no longer be ignored. Outside, the streetlights flickered over the snow. The town square looked almost new again, like it was seeing itself clearly for the first time in a long time. That night, Lucas realized that change doesn't always arrive like a wave. Sometimes it comes as a ripple, one act of courage touching another, spreading slowly through the places we thought had grown numb. Grace had once written, "Every voice matters, even if it trembles." And here they were, an entire town learning to tremble together, learning to listen, learning to see the world not as something to own, but something to belong to. He thought of Sable and her cub out there in the forest, the quiet courage of survival. He thought of Grace's faith of the pocket watch still ticking by her photograph. Maybe healing wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about remembering it without turning away. When Lucas reached his truck, he noticed something on the front seat, a basket covered with a cloth. Inside were 2 loaves of bread and a note in careful handwriting for the road ahead. "You did well tonight. Marjorie." He smiled a tired, honest smile. As he started the engine, his radio crackled with static. Then a young voice, Eli's from the Junior Ranger Group, Officer Merritt. "I saw the bobcat again. She's near the creek. The cub's walking better." Lucas leaned back in his seat, the night pressing close around him. "Copy that," he said quietly, his voice steadier now. He didn't need to see it to believe it. Some stories once set in motion keep writing themselves. Before driving home, Lucas stopped by the old ranger cabin. The air smelled of pine smoke and thawing earth. The pocket watch still sat on the table beside Grace's notebook. He picked it up and turned it in his palm. The tick was faint but steady, just like before. He placed it back down and whispered, "We heard you, Grace." Finally. Outside, the forest breathed softly, alive, forgiving. The snow was melting now, slipping quietly into the soil, carrying the memory of all that had changed with it. Tomorrow, the rebuilding would begin of the forest, the town, and the hearts that had once turned away. If you've ever spoken up for something that mattered, even when your voice shook, this moment is yours too. Because change rarely starts in loud rooms or bright lights. It starts in the quiet with one person brave enough to tell the truth and another willing to listen. And when a community begins to listen together, even the smallest town can sound like a miracle. When the thaw finally came to Willow Creek, it didn't rush in like a flood. It came slowly in small drips from the eaves, in the soft collapse of snowbanks, in the way light began to linger just a little longer on the pine needles. The winter had broken quietly, like an old promise kept. Lucas noticed it first in the mornings. The air was still cold, but it carried a different kind of breath, not bitter anymore, but clean. The creek, once locked beneath a sheet of ice, began to move again, whispering through the rocks with the voice of something reborn. He drove out toward the cabin each day, not out of duty, but because the forest had become part of his rhythm now. The world out there spoke softer than people did, and he had learned to listen. Sable and her cub were no longer hiding. He spotted them near the tree line, the cub limping less with each passing day, the mother still watchful but no longer wary of him. Once she paused long enough to meet his eyes before disappearing into the underbrush. It was the closest thing to a thank you he'd ever received. Word of what happened at the town meeting had spread beyond Willow Creek. A regional conservation group had reached out offering to help restore the forest, to replace the old traps with nesting boxes, to clear the debris still buried under frost. Volunteers came, teachers, retired loggers, even kids from the high school. They didn't come to prove anything. They came because in some quiet way, Grace Holloway's story had become their own. Lucas stood beside them as they worked. Shovels broke through the topsoil, the sound steady and deliberate, like the pulse of life returning. Marjorie arrived mid-morning with coffee and warm bread, and Eli carried a small hand-painted sign he'd made himself, Grace Holloway Sanctuary, where kindness took root. Lucas read it once, then twice, feeling his throat tighten. He lifted the post, set it into the ground, and the group fell silent for a moment, a prayer without words. The following week, Lucas visited the clinic in town. He'd been invited to speak to a group of younger officers about environmental responsibility. The words felt stiff, too formal, but he went anyway. He didn't bring reports or charts. He brought the old pocket watch. He held it up in front of the small crowd and said quietly, "This belonged to a woman who refused to stop believing that good can outlast the bad, even when no one believed her." He told them about Grace, about Sable, about the night the forest spoke. He told them that law and mercy were not opposites, they were partners. The world doesn't need more protectors who follow rules. It needs protectors who listen. When he finished, no one clapped, but several heads bowed and a few tears were wiped discreetly away. That was enough. Later, as he walked out into the spring air, a young officer caught up to him and said, "Sir, I didn't know compassion could sound like that." Lucas smiled. It's the only kind that lasts. The thaw wasn't just in the weather, it was in the way people looked at one another again. Neighbors began talking across fences. The mayor, quieter now, humbler, joined the cleanup crews. Someone even left wildflower seeds in small jars on the steps of Town Hall with a note that read, "For Grace, for what we almost forgot." Kindness has a way of circling back like warmth seeping into frozen ground. You can't rush it, but when it comes, it changes everything it touches. Lucas often thought about how long it takes for a place or a person to heal. Maybe forever. Maybe just long enough for one act of goodness to take hold and keep growing. When he looked at the sanctuary sign, when he heard laughter among the pines again, he felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. Not every redemption looks like triumph. Sometimes it looks like small hands planting saplings in cold earth. Like a wildcat walking freely through land once scarred by fire. Like a town remembering how to love what's fragile instead of fearing it. Lucas realized that faith, whether in God, in nature, or in people, isn't about believing everything will be easy. It's about believing that doing the right thing will still matter, even when no one's watching. Grace had lived that way. Sable did too, in her own quiet way. And now, so did the people of Willow Creek. Every gesture, every shared loaf of bread, every repaired fence, they were all small proofs that goodness was still alive. Not loud, not perfect, just steady. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the valley, Lucas sat on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. The forest glowed gold, the air carrying the scent of wet soil and pine. He could hear the creek nearby gurgling like laughter. The pocket watch ticked softly beside him. He turned it over in his hand, brushing his thumb over the initials on the back, GH. Then, from the edge of the trees came a rustle. Sable moving gracefully through the tall grass. The cub larger now followed her, stopping once to glance back toward the porch. For the first time, Lucas didn't reach for his camera. He simply watched them go, his eyes full, but his heart light. Maybe that's what closure really is, the moment you stop needing to hold the story and just let it live. As dusk deepened, lanterns flickered on across town. The soft hum of life, distant voices, a radio playing somewhere drifted through the trees. Lucas rose, slipping the pocket watch into his jacket. Tomorrow they'd be dedicating a small display at the town hall. Grace's photograph, the watch, and a simple brass plaque for those who kept faith when the world went quiet. He smiled at the thought. Somewhere inside him, the ache that had lived there for years finally eased. The forest no longer felt haunted. It felt whole. He closed the cabin door gently behind him, the warmth of the fire curling at his back. Outside, the last of the snow melted into the earth, carrying with it everything the cold had tried to keep. If you've ever carried hope through a long winter in your heart, your home, or your faith, let this be your reminder. Spring always finds a way. It may come slowly, unseen, through small acts of love and quiet forgiveness. But it comes. And when it does, the world doesn't just thaw, it begins again. Some miracles don't arrive with trumpets or thunder. They don't break the sky open or stop the world in its tracks. They arrive quietly, like sunlight through pine branches, like the first wildflower breaking through thawed earth. That's how it happened in Willow Creek. The miracle didn't roar, it whispered. Spring had settled across the valley. The snow was gone, replaced by the tender green of new grass pushing through old soil. The air carried the scent of rain and pine, a melody only the mountain could write. The forest, once scarred and silent, had found its voice again. And so had the people. Lucas stood outside the town hall that morning on the same steps where arguments once echoed, where whispers of blame used to linger. Now the space was filled with something gentler: laughter, quiet conversation, and the sound of children chasing one another through puddles. Inside, sunlight spilled through the tall windows and fell across a small display near the entrance. On the table sat a glass case, and inside it a brass pocket watch still ticking. Next to it, a simple photograph, Grace Holloway in her ranger's jacket, smiling, her eyes turned slightly toward the woods behind her. Beneath it, a plaque read, "For those who listen to the quiet things and protect them." People stopped as they passed. Some bowed their heads. Some just stood there a while, letting the silence speak. Later that afternoon, Lucas drove out to the edge of the sanctuary. The road curved gently toward the forest where Grace's cabin stood rebuilt, its windows catching the golden light of sunset. Volunteers were planting new seedlings, pine, birch, and maple, their laughter carried on the wind. The sign Eli had painted stood proudly by the gate, Grace Holloway Sanctuary, where kindness took root. Marjorie was there too, passing around mugs of coffee. The mayor helped set the last stone along the path, his hands covered in dirt instead of signatures. And when their work was done, everyone stood in quiet awe at what they had built. Not just a sanctuary for animals, but a reminder of who they could be when they chose compassion over comfort. Lucas walked a short distance away, down toward the creek where the ice had melted weeks ago. The water was clear now, sliding smoothly over river stone. He crouched down, letting his hand rest in the current. It was cold, alive, forgiving. And then he saw her, Sable the bobcat, moving along the opposite bank, sleek and strong, her cub trotting beside her. She stopped at the water's edge, looked across at him and held his gaze. The moment stretched thin, just man and wild creature sharing the same breath. Then, without a sound, she turned and slipped into the tall grass, vanishing into the trees. That evening, Lucas sat on the porch of the cabin scout's head, resting by his boots. The pocket watch lay open beside him, ticking softly in the dim light. Each sound, each small pulse of time felt like a heartbeat carried across years from Grace's hands to his. He thought about how far they'd all come. A mother who refused to stop fighting a town that finally learned to listen. A man who found his faith again in the most unlikely place, the wilderness. He remembered the first night he'd seen Sable in the snow carrying her injured cub through the dark. He'd thought she was just surviving. But now, sitting there as spring settled over the forest, he realized she'd been teaching him something all along. She hadn't given up because love doesn't. It endures quietly. It mends what's broken, not with noise, but with persistence. And maybe that's what miracles really are. Not the grand moments that stop the world, but the small ones that help it keep turning. The older Lucas got, the more he understood that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes like the thaw. Slow, uncertain, sometimes hidden beneath layers of cold we didn't even realize we'd built around ourselves. But when it does come, when the ice finally melts, it doesn't just free what was trapped. It feeds what will grow next. He looked out across the field where volunteers had left for the day. The new saplings bent softly in the evening wind, their roots settling into soil that had once been ash. Nearby, the creek shimmered with light, a mirror of everything they'd restored. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom, Grace the bobcat or something larger that had been guiding them all along. The forest answered with a single bird call, high and pure, the sound carried over the hills like a prayer. Kindness, Lucas thought, isn't a thing you lose. It's a thing you forget to practice. But even after years of neglect, it waits patient, unbroken, ready to return the moment someone decides to live by it again. That's what this place had become, proof that mercy still weighed in a modern world too quick to move on. Proof that even when faith feels far away, there's still a quiet force in nature, in people working toward restoration. Every healed paw print, every planted seed, every soft thank you whispered into the wind, they were all part of something bigger than survival. They were part of grace. And as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in bands of gold and rose, Lucas smiled. He didn't need to see what tomorrow looked like. He just needed to trust that it would come, and that somewhere in the wild heart of Willow Creek, life would keep choosing to begin again. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness still matters, even when the world feels cold, take a moment now to reflect. Ask yourself, where can I bring a little warmth back? Maybe to a person you've avoided, a cause you believe in, or simply to the earth beneath your feet. And if you believe, as Lucas did, that compassion can heal not just people, but the world itself, we invite you to keep that spirit alive. Click, like if this story gave you hope. Subscribe to stay close to stories that honor love, loyalty, and the quiet miracles still happening around us. And if your heart leads you to do a little more, consider pressing super thanks or donating below. Every contribution helps rescue and heal wild animals like the bobcat family you just met. Each act of generosity becomes a small light, proof that kindness, like spring, always returns.